Hi guys, welcome. We're about to get started. I just want a few more people to filter into, I know Zoom can sometimes be slow letting people in. All righty. Okay, great. We will go ahead and get started and people can filter in as they do. And hello to everyone out in YouTube land who's also watching there, in addition to our Zoom viewers. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Director of Events for Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's virtual program. Before we begin, I have just a couple of technical details to go over. First, I will be dropping a link in the chat where you can purchase a copy of The Tannery straight from Politics and Prose's website. And if you live in the DC area, we have 3 separate stores around the district that you can pick up your book from, or we ship to anywhere in the United States. So there is no excuse not to press that purchase button and get a book tonight. Also, if you have a question for the author, please submit it in the Q&A space, and we will get to those as they kind of accumulate. And you can submit your questions at any point between now and the end of the event, so feel free to ask away. Okay, on to the program. The Tannery, Michael Almond's debut novel, is set in Wilkes County, North Carolina in the year 1900. The beautiful young daughter of tannery owner Jacob Schumann is found dead on the north bank of a river, brutally beaten, a skinning knife in her chest. Readers are transported to the turbulent world of the post-Reconstruction South, reflecting issues prominent in today's headlines. Themes of Black voter suppression and intimidation, the violence and depravity of vigilante justice, and the rise of Jim Crow drive this narrative to its dramatic and surprising conclusion. Michael is in conversation with Jeffrey Blount, an award-winning author of 3 novels, Almost Snow White, winner of the 2013 USA Best Book Awards, Hating Heidi Foster, and The Emancipation of Evan Walls, winner of the 2020 National Indie Excellence Award for African American Fiction. He is also an Emmy Award-winning television director. During a 34-year career at NBC News, he directed a decade of Meet the Press, The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and other major special events. So now, please help me welcome Michael Almond and Jeffrey Blount onto your screens.
Thank you, Brittany. Michael, it's a joy to be here with you to talk about this wonderful book. And I just want to let the audience know that Michael's going to chat a little bit first and make a presentation. And after that presentation, I will launch into a Q&A session. I will ask some questions of my own, and I will also be looking in the Q&A section here on the screen so that I can pick up some of your questions, because we want to hear what you have to say about his presentation and your hopes for the book as well. So Michael, good to see you, and it's all yours.
Well, it's great to see you too, Jeffrey, and I want to tell you how much I sincerely appreciate, as a fellow novelist, that you would make time to moderate the program tonight. I sincerely appreciate that, but I also really have to thank all the folks at Politics and Prose for the opportunity for me to present my debut novel, The Tannery, and to make it known to the people who are viewing tonight. And I want to thank all of those viewers as well. I'm a big supporter, and I know that Jeffrey is too, of independent bookstores around the country. And it's well known that Politics and Prose is perhaps one of the most prestigious independent bookstores in the country. So it is truly an honor for me to be here tonight and to have this opportunity, and I very much appreciate that. So how in the world, to begin the presentation, how in the world did a retired international business lawyer, we can start the presentation anytime. Here we go. So how in the world did I, a retired international business lawyer from Charlotte, end up writing a historical fiction novel set in Wilkes County, North Carolina in 1900? Well, it goes back to the fundamental principle, I guess, that all my life I have been a voracious reader. For years, I've gotten through somewhere between 50 and 60 books a year. And Jeffrey, somewhere along the way, it began to occur to me that maybe, just maybe, there might be a book in me. And as I started thinking about it and looking into it, I was told about two fundamental rules for aspiring novelists and beginning writers. And number one was write what you know. Yeah. And the other was just tell the story. Don't get bogged down, just tell the story. So write what you know and tell the story. So how to begin? Well, first principles, I am a child of the South of a certain age. I was born and I grew up in a small town in rural North Carolina in the Piedmont foothills. And I came of age naturally during the upheavals of the civil rights movement of the of the 1960s. And so tell what you know and just tell the story. Well, I thought maybe I could combine the ideas of rural South and racial justice. Maybe I could combine those and build a story around that. I actually began thinking about the Tannery, I'm almost ashamed to admit, about 14 years ago. I began to do some basic background research and some outlining of the storyline. But you know, it was sort of a hobby of mine. And I really didn't make much progress on the book itself. But lawyers are linear thinkers. And so research and outlining comes naturally to us. So I was having fun doing that, but again, not making very much progress toward the book. But I remember very well a day in April of 2020, just as the COVID pandemic was beginning to take its grip in the United States and around the world. And we live on a farm in the North Carolina mountains. And so I came downstairs one day from my office with a sheaf of papers in my hand. And I was very, very proud about this because I was excited, and I approached my wife, Helen Ruth, and I handed her the papers and I said, Helen Ruth, I think this is it. I think I've overcome all the obstacles. I've overcome I ironed out all the wrinkles. Here's the outline. It's 12 pages long. I think it's pretty good. I think this is it. Well, I was surprised and excited, but I was sort of surprised when she looked at me and rolled her eyes and put her, my beautiful wife, Helen Ruth, put her hands on her hips, and she looked sternly at me and said, listen, Almond, you need to understand something. All of your friends and me, all of us, everyone, we are all sick and tired of hearing about your research and about your outline, blah, blah, blah. We're in the middle of a pandemic here. And so you've got no excuse. So either go upstairs and write the thing or shut up about it. And so like all good husbands, I did what I was told. I went upstairs and I sat down at my desk and I confronted Jeffrey, what I think was the most terrifying image I've ever seen in my life. And that was a blank computer screen. It's one thing to do research and outlining. Like I said, lawyers are good at that. But to stare at a screen and say, okay, now you've got to do it. You've got to bring the characters to life. You've got to create the characters. You've got to think about how do they talk? How do they talk to each other? What's their motivation and how do they behave and react to one another? And how in the world do you weave into the story all of the rich historical detail and background that you want to integrate into the book without slowing the book down or interfering with the pace? In short, I knew what I wanted to do, but I wasn't really sure that I knew how to do it. But nevertheless, 5 months and 110,000 words later, the manuscript was complete. And here we sit tonight, and the Tannery is on the bookshelves at Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington. So it's been quite a journey. It's been quite a ride. So what kind of book is it? Well, as Brittany explained to you in her introduction, it's a murder mystery and it's a legal thriller, but it's deeper than that. It's also a story about justice as local lawyer Ben Waterman struggles to save the life of Virgil Wade, who was a poor mixed race teenage boy in Wilkes County, North Carolina, who has been accused of the brutal murder of Rachel Schumann, the beautiful young daughter of tannery owner Jacob Schumann, the biggest employer in town. And he's been put into the Wilkes County jail. So who killed Rachel Schumann and why? Well, the Vincent Tolliver, the local prosecutor, thinks he's got his man. and he's put Virgil Wade in jail, and he thinks the case is open and shut. And why wouldn't he think that? Because after all, it's Virgil Wade's skinning knife with his hand-carved initials on the bone handle that is buried to the hilt in Rachel Schumann's chest. But Ben Waterman, the local lawyer, at the request of the governor, who's also in the book from Wilkes and a friend of Ben Waterman's, he asked Ben to investigate. And Ben does investigate, and he uncovers evidence, and the evidence that he uncovers actually does not fit the prosecutor's case. And in fact, it points in an entirely different direction. But can he prove it? Can Ben Waterman convince an all-male, all-white jury in a small southern town in rural North Carolina of the innocence of a mixed-race boy accused of beating and murdering a beautiful young white woman? Can he do that? To me, the Tannery, I like to think about it as sort of more than a book. In a way, it's kind of a time machine that I hope transports readers to a different time and place at the beginning of the Jim Crow era in North Carolina and throughout the South. I'm a big fan of historical fiction, and I hope that many of the folks listening in tonight are as well. And for me, at least, when I read a work of historical fiction like The Tannery, I want to learn something new that I didn't know before I read the book. And I think that's true of most of us. But I also want to know where the historical ends and the fiction begins, where the demarcation line is between reality and imagination. In The Tannery, the crime, the murder, and all of the characters that are directly associated with the crime and the murder and the trial, these are all imaginary characters. But the historical characters and venues and events that are described in the book are really quite real. So the storyline and the narrative of The Tannery must be understood in its proper historical context. And so a little bit of a history lesson now. This requires a deeper dive into some of the darker and more shameful forces and personalities that were at work in North Carolina during the pivotal election year of 1900. 1900 to me sort of marks a transition between the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the progress that was made during Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction years in terms of racial equity, and the beginning of the 20th century and the advent of the Jim Crow segregationist era in North Carolina and throughout the South, the white supremacy movements as well. Well, the Civil War, of course, changed everything. As I write in the book, for North Carolina to fight the war was its inescapable destiny, but to lose it was a moral necessity. Wilkes County, North Carolina, is in the western part of the state, in the foothills and the mountainous part of the state. And in that part of the state was very much pro-union, very much anti-secession. They didn't want to leave the Union. But when the decision was made, the men of Wilkes and the men of western North Carolina did their duty, and they marched off to war. Ironically, and many people don't know this, North Carolina, which was the last state to leave the Union and join the Confederacy, accounted for more than 25% of all Confederate dead and wounded during the war. And of the men from Wilkes who marched off to war, fewer than 25% of them returned, and many of them were disfigured and disabled. The South, of course, found itself defeated on the battlefield. It was occupied by federal troops, and its economy was in ruins. In North Carolina at the end of the war, the total population was about 1 million people. And of those, more than 330,000 were poor, uneducated, but hopeful Blacks. Why uneducated? Of course, they were uneducated because in North Carolina, like in most all Southern states, it was a crime to teach a Black person how to read and write. But nevertheless, these Black folks were hopeful. They were legally free, newly emancipated, but they also found themselves completely on their own, and their status and prospects were unclear. But between 1865 and 1870, the three Reconstruction amendments to the United States Constitution were ratified. And these, the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship and civil rights to Blacks, and the 15th Amendment established the right of Black men only, because women in the United States didn't get the right to vote until 1919. But the 15th Amendment established the right of Black men to vote. And boy, did they vote. Black men, after Reconstruction, went to the poll, they went to the registrars in droves, and they registered to vote. And they could be counted on election day to turn out somewhere between 80, 90%, even more than that. And guess what? They all voted Republican. Why Republican? Because the Republican Party at that time was the party of Lincoln. It was the party of emancipation. And they were successful in their voting. Across the South, more than 2,000 Black men were elected to state and local offices, and more than 200 federal Black men were either elected or appointed to federal offices. The Democrats, the white Southern Democrats, on the other hand, were and always had been the pro-slavery party ever since the party was founded during the days of Thomas Jefferson. And they were also, of course, the leaders of the secessionist movement that led to the Civil War. Now, during Reconstruction, when the South was occupied by federal troops, white Southern Democrats could only seethe and grit their teeth and bide their time. But after the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the withdrawal of the federal troops, Democrats slowly but surely gradually began to regain control of Southern legislatures, including North Carolina. But Blacks still continued to vote, and with some success. Take, for example, George Henry White from North Carolina. He served in the United States Congress from 1897 to 1901. And during the time he was in the Congress, he was the only Black serving in the United States Congress. In fact, George Henry White from North Carolina would be the only Black from the South to serve in the United States Congress until the election of Barbara Jordan from Texas in 1972. Think about that. From 1901 to 1972, not a single Black from the South was in the United States Congress. Now, all of this Black voting and Black office holding, well, this proved intolerable to the white ruling class. By 1898, they were fed up, they had had enough, and they needed a new strategy for the election of 1898. And they found it in two obnoxious words. And the strategy was white supremacy. The architects of the white supremacy strategy in North Carolina were four men, and they were all prominent Democrats. Furnifold Simmons was a former United States congressman. He was the chairman of the state Democratic Party. He was elected by the North Carolina legislature as a reward for the white supremacy strategies to serve 30 years in the United States Senate, and he was actually a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1920, unsuccessful. He was aided by future governors, Charles B. Aycock and Cameron Morrison, and they were supported by Josephus Daniels, who was the publisher and editor of the most influential paper in North Carolina newspaper at that time, the Raleigh News and Observer. And together, these four men conceived and executed a brilliantly, spectacularly successful white supremacy campaign in 1898 and again in 1900 that would firmly establish the Democratic Party in North Carolina as the one-party dominant party in the state for over 100 years. The white supremacy strategy had two goals. Number one was to gin up fear and hatred of Black people among whites, all whites, rich and poor of any class. And the second goal was to, as they put it, to redeem the state of North Carolina from what they called Negro domination by first restricting and then eliminating, ultimately, Black participation in the political process. The first goal was to be achieved through hateful propaganda and scurrilous race baiting, led by Josephus Daniels and his Raleigh News and Observer, but he was soon followed by other newspapers across the state as they soon joined the feeding frenzy. The second goal was to be achieved through intimidation, violence, terrorism, and murder. Remember, the second goal was the restricting and then ultimately eliminating Black participation in the political process. And the instrument to achieve this goal were the red shirts. And these were organized, armed mobs, armed bands of vigilantes. They were the successors to the Ku Klux Klan, and they were proudly and publicly recognized, no effort to hide it. They were proudly and publicly recognized as the official paramilitary arm of the state Democratic Party. Well, it all came to a head in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. On November the 10th, 1898. Wilmington at that time was North Carolina's largest city. Excuse me just a moment. Excuse me. Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city. It was majority Black, and it had a thriving Black middle class, including many educated professionals. And most importantly, it had a duly elected, legitimate, biracial city government. Well, on that awful day in November of 1898, just 2 days after the November election, which marked the end of the first of the white supremacy campaigns, a mob of more than 2,000 white men, led by Cameron Morrison, the red shirts, and supported by 2 rapid-fire machine guns, staged what can only be called a political coup d'etat, a violent coup d'etat in the city of Wilmington. The mob attacked Black neighborhoods. They burned the Black newspaper to the ground. They removed and exiled the duly elected city government and replaced it with white supremacist Democrats. And more than 2,000 Blacks and white Republicans were permanently exiled from the city. To this day, the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 marks the only violent overthrow of a duly elected government at any level in the history of the United States. Most tragically, somewhere between 60 and 300 Blacks were murdered in the Wilmington Massacre. 60 to 300, the exact number is not, cannot be, and will never be known. But somewhere between 60 and 300 Blacks were murdered, and this was reported in newspapers all across the country. But despite this, no one was ever arrested, no one was ever charged, no one was prosecuted. And the awful truth of the Wilmington Massacre was hidden and buried for over 100 years. Looking back, it can be said that the Wilmington Massacre and the election of Charles B. Aycock in 1900, after the second of the white supremacy campaigns, these 2 events marked the beginning of the segregationist Jim Crow era in North Carolina and across the South. Well, the characters in the Tannery, getting back to the book now, the characters in the Tannery could not see into the future because they didn't have a time machine like we do. But these white supremacy campaigns were unbelievably successful. So let's fast forward the time machine just a couple of years to see what I mean by that. Black voter registration in North Carolina in 1896 was about 125,000 Black men. And they turned out routinely, they turned out on election day somewhere around 90%. In fact, the participation of Blacks in the 1896 election, together with the white Republicans and the Populist Party, they joined together to elect a Republican governor in 1896, the last one elected in North Carolina until 1972. And it was the election of this Republican governor in 1896 that spurred on those 4 men that I told you about before to start the white supremacy campaigns. Well, at any rate, Black voter registration in North Carolina was 125,000 in 1896. To talk about the success of the white supremacy campaigns, in 1902, the total number of Black votes cast in North Carolina had declined to fewer than 6,000. And by 1904, the total number of Black votes cast in North Carolina was fewer than 1,300. 1896, 125,000. 1904, fewer than 1,300. And of course, Black voting rights were not restored in North Carolina or in the South until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But the legacy of Wilmington goes beyond 1898. And after Wilmington, violence against Blacks exploded across the South. The Klan reemerged as a terrifying force. And the Equal Justice Initiative reminds us, and they report, that more than 4,000 Black lynchings occurred across the South between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and 1950. And white mob race riots against Blacks occurred all across the country. Louisiana, East St. Louis, Atlanta, Omaha, Chicago, Washington, Arkansas, Florida, Oregon, and of course, the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, when another white mob of white vigilantes, armed vigilantes, attacked and burned down the thriving residential and business community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, committing more than 300 murders and leaving 10,000 Blacks homeless as they burned down 35 square blocks of the city of Tulsa. So this then is the historical context. This is the world that the characters in the Tannery find themselves. One of the most dramatic scenes in the book occurs at the Wilkes County Jail. Virgil Wade is incarcerated there, awaiting trial, but the townspeople in Wilkes are up in arms about this, and they want justice, and they want it now. And so does the Klan. And so late one night, the Klan shows up at the county jail. They plant a burning cross in front of the jail. They throw a burning torch into the jail where Virgil is being held, trying to burn him out so they can get his hands on him and so that they can lynch him. But because of Ben Waterman's timely intervention, the attack fails, but just barely. It was a close run thing in the book. And so the governor of the state, in response, it was such a close run thing that the governor of the state declares a state of emergency, and he sends the militia to Wilkes to retrieve the boy and take him to Raleigh for safekeeping until his trial. Well, Vincent Tolliver, the prosecutor, he doesn't like that at all. He's running for election in the fall, and he wants to ride this trial all the way to victory in November. So he files a motion in the local Superior Court in Wilkes County asking to have the declaration of emergency dissolved and to have the Wade boy brought back to Wilkes County immediately. By this time in the book, Ben Waterman is representing Virgil Wade, and he objects, obviously, to the motion from the prosecutor. And the court hearing is held in the old courthouse on the courthouse square in Wilkes County, North Carolina. And Ben Waterman has some questions for the sheriff of Wilkes County. His name is Jimmy, but people call him Redbone. His name is Jimmy Redbone Poindexter. And Poindexter is on the stand, and Ben has some questions for him. And here's the scene in the Wilkes County courthouse. Ben looked down at his notes and then asked, "You testified that the attack on the jail was just some boys raising a little Cain, right?" "That's what I said," Poindexter nodded. "A whole lot of nothing, really." So Ben continued, "Let's assume the judge grants Mr. Tolliver's motion and the Wade boy is returned to your jail. It's just you and Mr. Goins there, right? To guard the boy, keep him safe, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week?" "Well, that's right, but," and Ben interrupted, talking faster now, in the flow. "Let's suppose the Klan comes back for the boy with even more men this time. Are you telling this court that you are prepared to use force to protect him? That you can protect him? That you will, without hesitation, take your Winchester rifle and open fire on the Klansmen, some of whom may be sitting in this very courtroom, some of your friends, your neighbors, trade their lives for Virgil Wade's?" Poindexter sat silent, his jaw working. Ben turned, faced the spectators. "Take a look out there, Sheriff. They're all here, right in front of you. All good citizens of Wilkes. Tell me, Sheriff. Point them out to me. Call their names. You said you know them. Tell me which of these men you would shoot first and how many, just to save the life of a poor colored boy. An uneasy rumbling filled the courtroom as spectators looked nervously left and right, fixed their eyes on the sheriff, waiting for his answer. Poindexter gazed into the crowd before him, turned to Tolliver with a helpless look. Then he turned to the judge, but there was no relief to be had there. Shaking his head, his jaw firmly set, his shoulders slumped, Poindexter slowly rose, stepped out of the witness box, and started back to his seat at the prosecution table. The sharp rap of Judge Transu's gavel echoed like a rifle shot through the courtroom. Sheriff Poindexter, get back up here. Take your seat, sir. Poindexter kept walking. Ben threw his hands in the air, blew out a sigh. No more questions for this witness, Your Honor, he said grimly. So at the end of the day, The Tannery is a murder mystery and a legal thriller, but it's also a story about justice. Ben's quest for justice for Virgil Wade in a time and a place long ago where it seemed that everything was stacked against them. I'm going to conclude and stop where I started the book, and that is with 3 short quotes at the beginning, which I'd like to share with you. The first is from William Faulkner, Nobel Prize winner in literature, Southern novelist, known to us all. Faulkner writes, and The Tannery, of course, is a book. It's historical fiction. It's a book about the past. But Faulkner writes, the past is never dead. It's not even past. The second quote is from the book of Ecclesiastes, where it says, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. But the third and final and hopefully more optimistic quote is from the African-American poet Maya Angelou. And she writes, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. And so, folks, these are the lessons of The Tannery. And I really appreciate your time and attention tonight, your interest in the book, and I hope that you will take advantage of the opportunity on the screen to pick up a copy from Politics and Prose. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Michael, thank you for that wonderful presentation. That was really informative. And I loved how you got to the end and you sort of gave the description of the book and how the story flows, which is good because it gives us time to drill in on some of the more interesting questions. So I'm going to start asking questions myself, and I want you folks to know that you can add your questions in the queue under the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And I will try and keep an eye on that and bring some of your questions into our conversation. So Michael, I want to start by taking you back to the beginning of your presentation when you talked about one of the things a writer must do is write what you know. And you have had such a varied life. You've traveled extensively. You worked around the world. You know more than your job. But you chose to, when you sat down and looked at that blank piece of paper and you did your research, you chose to pick justice. What about justice stood tall above all the other things you could have decided to tackle? Why did you choose justice? Why was that important for you to put out in front of the reading public?
Well, thank you for that, Jeffrey. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, I am a child of the South. I grew up in the small town of Pilot Mountain, North Carolina, during the Civil Rights Movement and all that meant and all that occurred during that period. I saw the struggle for justice then. It had an impact on me, as it did most people my age. And I carried that with me, as I hope most people do, those memories and that experience with me all my life. Also, you know, when you talk about writing what you know, there are two ways to know things. One way is to experience them. And so the experience of my childhood in that small town, which had a sizable Black population as well. The whole town was only 1,200 people. But to grow up in that atmosphere and to live through the movement for justice and civil rights had its impact. But I'm also a history fan. Having lived so much of it, I'm a big fan of history. So one other way to know something is to learn about it and to read about it. And during that voracious reading that I've been talking about at the beginning, I began to get interested not only in the Civil War and its aftermath and all the rest of it, but I realized how much I didn't know about Reconstruction and the aftermath of Reconstruction. Those years were a mystery to me. I generally knew what happened, but I thought I didn't know as much, Jeffrey, as I thought I knew. And so as I started getting into the book and doing the research, I was amazed. The men that I told you about, who were the architects of the white supremacy campaigns of 1898 and 1900, were presented to me in my 8th grade North Carolina history class as heroes. Charles B. Aycock, the supreme segregationist, was revered as the education governor of North Carolina. Cameron Morrison was the Good Roads governor of North Carolina from Charlotte. And Josephus Daniels, who the scurrilous campaign in the press was his product. He served for 8 years as Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of the Navy, and then was later appointed by FDR as ambassador to Mexico.
And this is actually where I was going with that, because you talk about, you know, being raised during those times, influenced by those men who had influence on your life and the lives of all of the North Carolinians. And it's during the time of the civil rights movement, but it's also the Vietnam War. There's also women's rights. There's a lot of things coming to fruition or in conflict in the 60s, as you talk about the time you're growing. So I guess the reason I'm trying to drill down to why you, a white male Southerner, when given the opportunity to sit down and write a book, even after you took up the issue of justice, you decided to tackle the third rail of race in this book. So you knew it, but it didn't mean you had to challenge it.
To write about it. I didn't have to write about it.
Why did you decide to do that?
Well, the deeper I got into the research, the more I understood that this book needed to be more than just a murder mystery and a legal thriller. As I began to uncover some of these, what I call darker and more shameful forces and personalities that were at work at that time period, around 1900, the more I began to realize what I never expected when I first started this thing. And that is, these themes are with us today.
Yes.
The themes that I write about in the Tannery, racial bigotry, voter suppression, violence. You'd like to think that we had put all that in our past, but we haven't. I had no idea when I started this project that the themes that drive the Tannery would prove to be as relevant or would resonate so loudly and clearly as they do in today's modern polarized society and world in the United States. And so when I began to understand that what was happening around me contemporaneously had its antecedents in what happened in the book I was trying to write, I think I knew what I had to do then.
Well, and author Frederick Kemp, excuse me, says, though set in the past, this novel is a must-read for a country combating the enduring racism and voter suppression of the present. So obviously other readers are getting what you were putting down, understanding that there's a comparison here. And in telling your story, you're shedding some light on what's happening today. One of the other things with regard to race that I have to tell you that I was quite impressed with, because, in the writing world today, as you know, there's a conversation about who can write whose story and who can who can write what character.
Right.
And again, to go back to a white male from North Carolina choosing to write Black characters in stressful situations. And I'm going to take two examples. So in the book, there is Jewel Ponder, who is the maid, the cook, the housekeeper at the large hotel, which plays a big part in the book. Now she comes into contact with Mr. Waterman, Claire Elise, who runs the hotel on a constant basis, and they show a lot of friendship and one could say love towards her. But you don't get caught up into the reflection. Her reflection is real in that she sets physical boundaries and at least verbal boundaries about what she can and can't say. Then you go to a situation, without telling the readers too much, because this is a really, really powerful part of the book, when young Virgil Wade is confronted by a very powerful white woman who essentially, she's inebriated and tries to seduce him, and he can't leave and he can't stay without being in trouble. And it's sort of, I started thinking, here is something that's reminiscent of the Emmett Till, of the Scottsboro Boys, of Central Park, of the quote Karens of today who use the power of white femininity to control and people of color. You touch those two, the characters and their relationships to their white characters counterparts. You wrote those beautifully with a whole lot of insight. Where did that come from?
Well, first of all, Jeffrey, I have to tell you, I can't tell you how much it means to me to hear you say that. I realized that the day that I made the decision to send the advanced reader copy of the Tannery to you was a high wire, no net exercise. I had no idea because I did not have any other people of color who were my advanced readers. And so you were it. And I didn't know, and I don't think I could know whether or not I got that right.
Yep.
But another African-American advanced reader was Harvey Gantt, who was the first Black mayor of Charlotte, and is someone that I worked very closely with when I was practicing law in Charlotte. He was elected as the mayor with 57% of the vote in a city that was only 25% Black. He was the first student at Clemson, Black student at Clemson University, and he married the first Black woman admitted to Clemson University. So I sent it to both of you, and you were both very, very supportive. So I don't think I can say I got it right, but you can, and you just did, and I really appreciate that, and it means so much to me. But I lived in the community I lived in. I grew up in the society that I grew up in, and although there's nothing autobiographical about the book at all, there's not a single character in the book that doesn't resemble in many ways people that I grew up with and knew in my life growing up in that small town.
Well, it's one thing to grow up around it. It's another thing to be able to put it in context and bring it out. So the excellent job, and that makes the story so much more legitimate, I think, when you're really talking about the fear of these people. I mean, you look at when the family has to choose between, when Mr. Waterman goes to the family and says, I want to represent your son, and they're nervous about this. It has to go through the minister. They're nervous about this. There's no Benjamin Crump. There's no Black attorney. So they have to turn themselves over to that. And all of that, I want to say, is rendered very well. And I thank you for that. But it's not just me, and it's not just the other gentleman who read the book, because what we know is that there's a certain organization that found out about this book as you were writing it and followed you about it. Why don't you tell the readers about that?
Well, this is truly remarkable, Jeffrey. And who knows where this is going. But our mutual publisher called me one day, and he said, I just got off a very interesting telephone conversation about your book. Well, the book had not even come out at that point. It came out on October the 19th, and this was a couple, 3 weeks before that. And I said, oh, really? What kind of conversation was it? And he said, well, I just finished a conversation with somebody who called me from the NAACP. And I think, oh my God, somehow they've gotten a hold of a copy of it and they don't like it. And they're calling John Kohler because they're disappointed and they think I got it wrong. And he said, oh, no, it's nothing like that. And I said, well, what in the world could it have been about? Well, it turns out that the NAACP sponsors every year something called their annual Image Awards.
Right.
And they basically recognize human achievement by African Americans, but also by people who are connected to and part of the movements for social justice and equality across the whole range of human achievement, whether it's literature or whether it's music or whether it's sports or wherever it is, sort of like the Heisman Trophy and the Super Bowl and the Grammys and the Tonys and the Oscars all put together. And they told John Kohler at Kohler Books, they said, we've been tracking this book, The Tannery, on Mr. Almond's website and on his Instagram account. And quite frankly, we think that this book would be an excellent candidate for nomination for the NAACP Image Award in the category of debut author. And so we would very much appreciate it. We are soliciting you to please nominate this book in this category, and he has done so. Now, who knows where this will lead? I've already got my concession speech prepared, Jeffrey. Like at the Academy Awards, everyone who loses says that it was an honor just to be nominated. But in this case, it's a very moving experience for me to have the book recognized in this way. It's just a wonderful experience for me. I can't describe it.
Well, good. And I'm with them. I think it's deserving of that. And so I wish you luck. But before we move on I want to talk a little bit just about the book and some texture within the book. I want to read a question from Linda, who asks, what was horrifying to me reading about 1900 in North Carolina? Much of what I knew about is that we are going there again. Do you have hope we can overcome this attack on our very democracy? That's from Linda.
I have hope. Hope springs eternal. But I'm concerned, as I think we all are. All thinking people in our country today must be concerned with our democratic experiment and where we are going from here on issues such as racial justice, equity, human rights. We have to be sensitive to these things and we have to worry about them. But on the point of, do I have hope? The three quotes at the beginning were very carefully selected and thought through. I had to fight with my editor at Kohler Books. He says, you can have one quote, but not three. And I said, no, you're missing the point. That the three quotes are the lessons of the Tannery. The one is from Faulkner, which says, the past is never dead. It's not even past. And Ecclesiastes says, what has happened before, it's going to happen again. You just better get ready for it. There's nothing new under the sun. If it happened before, it's going to happen again. Just like Linda's question was talking about.
Yep.
But you got to end it with Maya Angelou's quote, where it says that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. So let's face it with courage.
Well said, well said. So now I want to go to, you talked about it just a little bit, but author Fry Gaillard, I hope I'm saying that right, said that this was far more than a legal thriller. So what I want people to recognize is, when I go out and I talk to readers and everything, a lot of people they talk about genres. This is my favorite genre, and I like this and I like that. And a lot of people like crime and they like thrillers. I happen to feel that many, not all, but many thriller books are more into the action, or the plot, and oftentimes leave out the characters and leave out the texture of the novel. And so I like to refer to yours as a full novel, in the sense that there is all of that for those people who want the thrill, who want to try and figure out or don't know what's going to happen next, and are caught up in the actual playing out of the plot. It doesn't get better. But it also is a very sweet story in terms of the texture of the book and the culture of the book. You pull out so much of the culture of North Carolina in those times. There's so many little things about the texture of the South in that time, and
food,
very
food.
Much, yeah, food, absolutely. Very much a Southern novel, and I felt that, and it felt full, rich in characters, rich in story, and all of the thriller parts. So how hard was that for you?
That was easy, because that was right. That was writing what I know.
Yeah.
All of those scenes with Jewel Ponder and Clara Lee serving Ben Waterman food and Southern food, and going down to the what would be the modern day equivalent of the food vendor in the black town of Cairo.
Right.
All those things come very much from my experience growing up, and whenever I can get a good vegetable plate with cornbread, I'll do that in the South anytime. So a lot of these things, but getting back to the racial sensitivity thing again, mm-hmm. there are a couple of things that I hope will resonate with people, that just tiny things. One is Ben Waterman wants to talk to Jewel Ponder because he wants to use her as an intermediary so that he can talk to Virgil Wade's mother.
Right.
Okay. And so he very nicely says, I'd really like to talk to you, Jewel, about Virgil Wade and his role in this thing. And I'd like to talk to you about that for a moment. And I'd like for you to sit down here. Let's have a conversation. And it's a small part in the book, but she says, no, sir, I'd rather stand.
Yes. And that's one of the moments I was talking about earlier.
And she, in the South that I knew, no Black woman in that position would have ever sat down in that chair.
Yes.
Ever sat down in that chair. And it disappointed Ben, but he understood.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that, without giving away too much, the moment that Virgil Wade, around midnight on the evening of July the 4th, 1900, who's minding his own business, walking back to the Schumann Hotel where he's bunking for the night, and he goes past the bridge and he sees a light down under the bridge and goes to investigate, and there is a young, beautiful white woman alone, sitting on a quilt with a whiskey bottle.
Who he knows is extraordinarily powerful.
Yes, and he knows her. He's been seen in conversation with her earlier in the day.
Right.
I'm telling you that I think I know what I'm talking about when that boy understood immediately that he was very likely a dead man.
Yes.
Because there was no way he could stay, because if she didn't want him, if she wanted him to stay, there was no way he could leave.
Right.
Because of what, and if he stayed, there was no way he could escape the consequences of staying.
That's
so
right.
Virgil Wade in his own mind, whether he clearly understood it or not, but I think he must have thought, what can I do? What am I involved in here? There is no way out.
Oh, I agree. And that's exactly one of those moments I was talking about. And those are rich and those are truthful. And I think that adds to the whole environment that you created in talking about as we go from 1900 and we're post-Reconstruction and Black citizens are trying to find their way, and you get to a point where you get to Congress, then they change the rules basically, and George Henry White is walking away from Congress because he knows that the tide has turned.
Because his district was gerrymandered.
Gerrymandered, right? Which is what the Justice Department is just suing a state right now for exactly the same thing. So we're running out of time here, but I want every author, I think, at least I know when I sit down to write, I try to write with a purpose. I'm trying to say something. And when the reader closes the book for the final time, I want to leave them feeling something or pointed in a certain direction. What would you want a reader to take away at the last minute after they close the book? What do you want to say to them?
Oh my. Well, I hope, as I said about historical fiction, I hope that during the course of reading an entertaining and compelling novel, that they have learned something that they did not know before. I hope that the novel has taught them something about a period of history that is largely forgotten, but that is possibly repeating itself. I hope it tells people something about the gentleness of the South as well, and the good aspects of the South and Southern culture and Southern life, because that's my life, and I've found comfort in all of that. And I hope they understand that justice is elusive.
Yeah. So, and in turn, when you were giving that answer, I was thinking, so what did Michael learn about himself? What did the whole process? So you got 14 years of while you're still working as an attorney, you're researching and putting together that room we saw, and then you get your outline and you sit down to write a book. And what I know is that we all go through some changes when we're going through that story. And so we come to grips with, as authors, with things by the time we get to the end of the book too. So is there anything that you took away from this project through research, or just through getting to know your characters and making your characters go through certain things and having them come out of the other side? Did you learn anything that you didn't know beforehand?
Well, I did. And first of all, I think I learned that, in fact, I could do what I didn't know I could do.
There you go.
Which was an accomplishment in and of itself. And I'm thrilled at the way the novel has been received. I couldn't know, I'm a rookie at this, I'm a knife in this process, so I couldn't know where this was going. But it's been a tremendous experience to have this received this way. But it also opened up to me, I think, ideas for future projects, which obviously can't take 14 years each
Right.
to bring to fruition. But the Tannery and the research behind the Tannery taught me that there are other aspects of life in America, historical life in America, that involve injustice in other ways. For example, not just racial justice, but gender-based justice as well. And so I'm already thinking about a novel, the next novel, which might be a quasi-sequel, where Ben Waterman will return to defend a person accused of murder again, except this time it will be set in 1910 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, in one of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company's factories. And it will involve a white woman who is accused of murdering the shop foreman, who sexually abuses her. She works in the factory, who sexually abuses her in the back room of the tobacco factory off the shop floor. And I think that there are some elements of that, which I certainly won't reveal here, but I think there are some elements of that which will bring to light some long forgotten aspects of injustice in America, and in not just in the South, but in America, that people need to remember again.
Well, I'm smiling a little bit because I'm thankful for the tease. I wasn't expecting that. This is great. Thank you. So we've got more to look forward to. But for those of you who have not read The Tannery, I urge you to go online and buy it. Go to Politics and Prose and buy it. And when you go online, go to Politics and Prose and support your independent bookstores and buy this wonderful book. It's a history lesson. It's a story from the heart. It's a story of the heart. There are wonderful, incredible moments in it. There's some extraordinarily powerful moments in it. And I was certainly not disappointed, and I know you won't be either. So Michael, thank you so much for writing it and for bringing it forward for us.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. And thanks to Politics and Prose for the opportunity. to share the Tannery with all of you who are taking the time to view this program.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. Thank you to everyone watching. And like Jeffrey said, please support your local independent bookstore, especially now during this holiday season. We need it more than ever after these last 21 disastrous months. So the links are in the chat to purchase the Tannery and also to purchase Jeffrey's book, The Emancipation of Evan Walls. So both check those out. And again, thank you all for being here tonight. So stay well and stay well